So, a very good evening and welcome to the Kunsthistorisches Museum. It's great to see so many of you here this evening. My name is Jasper Sharp and I am the adjunct curator here at the Museum for Modern and Contemporary Art. This is the fifth and final talk of this year as part of our Modern and Contemporary program, and it's a great pleasure. I'm going to turn and face you a little bit more. It's a great pleasure to welcome Cecily Brown from New York. I assume you all know Cecily, which is why you're here, but I'm going to give a very rudimentary introduction to Cecily. Cecily was born in England in 1969 into a particularly artistic family. Her mother is a novelist, and her father was a very influential curator and art historian. She studied at the Slade, several places, but Slade School of Fine Arts in London, and graduated in 1993 at a time that the art world in London was bubbling in a very provocative and public way, with the sort of bubbling up of the YBA generation. And within a couple of years, Cecily made the decision to move to New York into a context and a climate with which she was less familiar, albeit a history of painting with which she was familiar. She moved there in '95 and soon after had her debut solo exhibition at the gallery of Jeffrey Deitch. And a couple of years later, at the age of 29, Cecily began working with Guggenheim Gallery and was propelled into a level of sort of public, what is the word? Renown, which, you know, is a lot for a young artist to be dealing with and showing all over the place, and had a hugely successful career, showing in many places, including here in Vienna, a gallery exhibition here, and also at the Sammlung Essel. And around 15 years later, Cecily made a break in her life, left the gallery and joined a wonderful gallery in New York, Paula Cooper Gallery, where she just closed an exhibition a couple of days ago, literally, a week or so ago, and also with Thomas Dane Gallery in London, where she's also had a first show, and is making, I think, some of the best paintings of her entire life at the moment. When I first invited Cecily to come for this talk, she said, well, Jasper, I love the Kunsthistorische, I'd love to come, but there's no way I can come in the autumn because I've got two very big shows, one at Paula Cooper Gallery and one which has just opened at the Whitworth Museum in Manchester, an exhibition of her drawings. So I'm really sorry, but it's just not going to work. And I said, well, we have a Rubens show. And there was the kind of silence on the email conversation, and then an email came back saying, any day, any time, any place. So I thought that is where we could start this evening, with some Rubens. There's a disclaimer I'm going to put in here. As much as Cecily likes Rubens, I dislike Rubens, except this exhibition that Galinda Gruber and Stefan Weppelmann has done is rapidly changing my mind. And I walked home today thinking, for the first time in my life, I actually really like Rubens for the first time. So thank you, Galinda. Sometimes you need to see a retrospective exhibition to understand. But so I asked, I was speaking with Cecily and various people in Cecily's studio in New York where you might have first encountered Rubens, and I assumed it might have been at the National Gallery in London, and this is one of their great pictures. I think this is the one you chose as...
First of all, I do want to say it's just such a thrill to be here. I mean, it's a huge honor. When Jasper told me today that this was where the talk would take place, I thought he was joking that it would actually be in this room, so I'm slightly in awe. But anyway, thanks to everyone for coming. It's really wonderful to be here. And yes, I was very enticed by the idea of coming to see Rubens in Vienna. And I don't remember the very first Rubens I saw, but this would have been one of them. And I think one of the things that I was first drawn to was actually the subject, just as much as the style, the way it was painted.
And the National Gallery was a place that you spent a lot of time when you were studying.
Yeah.
And was he among the first people that you sort of gravitated towards?
Yeah, I think it was basically Titian, Rubens, Caravaggio. They were some of the very first. I mean, it's such an amazing collection. It seems so long ago. I've been in New York now for longer than I ever lived in London. But I actually loved the Rubens Oil Sketches, I think, more than anything when I was a student. And they were really what got me, really turned me into a Rubens lover.
I put my favorite one from London, I have to say, Samson and Delilah, just because I think it's the longest arm that was ever painted, ever. And I think that's one thing that Rubens manages to get away with, because he's so good that he can do these things that a kind of high school teacher would reject and send back, but they're just so amazing. I think one of the reasons I've struggled with Rubens in the past is that he has a flamboyance to him, which reminds me of the reasons I struggle with opera, because I sometimes don't believe it. I can deal with theater, but I can't deal with opera because of all that fuzz of stuff around it. I'm sounding really unintellectual at the moment, but Rubens has something of this.
Absolutely, but I think that's why I love him. I mean, I love artifice. I love fakery. And in art, I like it to be big and larger than life and, you know, clearly made up. And I hadn't actually realized till this exhibition how much of Rubens was taken from other places, which I know we'll get to later. But it really is sort of pulled together from a lot of different places. But I love that. I mean, I love Hollywood and Broadway musicals, and which you probably hate as well. But I think Rubens is in that. I can see why some people might think it's a bit vulgar. It's not the most subtle. Like, if you're a Vermeer lover, maybe people are either more Vermeer or more Rubens. You know, he's more Dionysus. But I've just always, the flesh is obviously the main thing, but the muscularity, but the fleshiness and the movement are really the things that I just keep going back to, and the color.
I feel like when I look at them, they're kind of saying to me, have a drink, relax.
And what's not to like?
What's not to like? Get into it, you know? But I always feel a bit uptight when I look at Rubens, and I kind of think Rubens is just sort of saying, go with it.
Yeah.
You'll enjoy it, kind of thing. You have a sort of, obviously no one in this room ever met Rubens, but I imagine that as a character, he had some of this. I mean, you see his self-portraits and how he portrayed himself. I think it's interesting that you capture, I don't know if flamboyance is the right word, but you have a real vividness in the way you paint, but you manage in your persona to be a normal person, which is really nice. But I feel like it was sort of part of the whole thing he was doing then, the sort of character and the sort of playing a role and so on. I did have an oil sketch which doesn't really look a great deal like an oil sketch when it comes out of a projector. But there's a few beautiful ones in the exhibition, and we have some more beautiful ones in the collection here of the Academy of Fine Arts, which is now at the Theater Museum. Do you get something different from a smaller oil sketch than you get from, what do you get from this that you don't get from a larger, more sort of finished painting?
I mean, I think it's quite common probably among our generation, or even anyone from the 20th century, to prefer the unfinished or the rough. It's the same with Constable, you know, or even Degas. A lot of people, it's always more interesting to see, you know, more of their hand. The less finished, the better, as far as I'm concerned. And my least favorite Rubens are the very highly finished and highly polished, and probably the ones that made him the most popular and famous. I suppose, well, one thing is in the oil sketches, you pretty much know it's all him. Although, I mean, I'm not moralistic about that, because obviously his workshop were also incredibly talented. Yeah,
and Galinda was telling us today that actually paintings that were done by 2 or 3 artists were prized even more than just his single hand, which I had never realized.
Really interesting.
Either.
And a lot of them were huge stars themselves, or Snyders and Jordans, and Van Dyck worked for him. But, I mean, I just think the oil sketch, you see the facility of his hand. You see that he only needs to say something once. I also a real sucker for the sort of rosy gold. So often there's a more muted palette, but they're very luminous. So it's like they're more direct, like drawings often are, but I feel like you really see the thinking. And they feel, with the big commissions, of course they're very impressive, but I think there's more humanity and intimacy. That's kind of a cliche, but I really just feel you feel the process and you can feel him thinking things through. And there's just something more moving about the things that aren't fully said. I mean, surprise, surprise that I would say that.
I think they have a sort of immediacy. I mean, exactly what you said, but I feel like this man is just making this gesture, whereas in the painting, this is an oil sketch in the collection of the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London. I sort of feel that I think the painting for this is now lost, but were the painting to exist, that character would have a kind of solidity to him, which he doesn't have here. And I don't know, I mean, there's these two enormous altarpieces in the show here, and I just look at them and I just they strike me as being propaganda. They have this sort of overwhelming message to them, and this, I find 2 or 3 different ways into that. We were just talking about this before, but I find 2 or 3 different ways into this and 2 or 3 different ways out. And the large paintings have a kind of manifesto.
Finality. Yeah, no, absolutely. They feel like a final, finished statement, and it's they're both more sculptural in some ways and solid, but in some ways, it's harder to find a way into them. I don't know if that's just our postmodern sensibility.
I think it might be.
But there's the huge altarpieces are my least favorite, impressive as they are. I feel like I don't like feeling all the work behind something. I like things that feel like they just sort of came about, and there's a looseness and naturalness to these. I mean, it's always a great pleasure to see someone's... I like seeing something that seems like it was simple, and I don't like it to be facile. It's a big difference. It's not facile, but there's an ease, like a sort of laid-backness to his line, I suppose.
This is the painting in our collection, which...
You describe as bonkers.
I think it is completely bonkers. And every time I look at it, I actually think of you and your work. Not because I've seen you without your clothes on lots of times, but because it just strikes me as this sort of mad, ambitious composition which you yourself sort of encounter head-on repeatedly. And I've talked about your work, and other people have spontaneously talked about your work to me in front of this painting, and this has come up horribly on the slide, but this is a painting of yours from 2002 called Figures in a Landscape, and it's not necessarily the one I would choose to put, but it is the one I've chosen tonight. But there's something about the almost your inability to take in, I had almost never paid any attention to the landscape in this picture. Galinda suddenly said to me, look at this amazing landscape. I'm like, my God, I'd never noticed the landscape because there's like 7 layers on it. But one thing I wanted to talk about here is I remember once listening to you say that your biggest problem in putting a picture together was the bottom third of a picture. Yeah. And that you had often gone back to look at historical artists to see how they resolved, how they grounded things. Yes. Is that something that you feel you've...
No, I have to think about it every day. I mean, I had a studio visit when I was quite young from someone who said, look at your corners, they're pathetic. An older artist and suddenly I was like, oh, and I realized that my corners just sort of, everything sort of like faded away at the corners. And he said, if you notice in an old master painting, often each corner will be completely different from the other, and they were all absolutely pinned down. And from then on, I became very religious about trying to pin down my corners and be very aware of what they were doing. And of course, if you're dealing with squares and rectangles, you really should be conscious of your corners. But the bottom third is a problem for a couple of reasons. One is that often with a large painting, it's too low down. So you really have to remind yourself to work on it. Any painters will know that. If you don't watch out, everything becomes sort of at eye level. You have to remember to go high and go low. But I often took clues or take clues from old masters where when you start really looking for that, it's fascinating because often there'll be almost nothing in the bottom third, but you won't have noticed. So the eye, I think, naturally goes towards the middle of a painting. And often when you go to the bottom third, you realize there's just maybe, you know, sand, and then a well-placed leaf and a bug, and that's almost it, and maybe a signature. But it's absolutely alive because it's so calculatedly punctuated by these 3 or 4 things. And I mean, everyone does it. If you look at anyone from Bosch to Velázquez, they really, you know, are conscious of using that space. And often it's used as a sort of way into the rest of the picture, isn't it? Like if you think of Chardin, would do it very obviously.
Bruegel's brambles in the Hunters in the Snow, they're what actually kind of just lead you into the whole thing.
Sure, and lots of people will very deliberately lead you in. But it's a great game to play with old masters. Mondrian
couldn't do corners, which is why he did ovals for so long. He just couldn't do corners.
Is that right?
And that's, in his early landscapes, they kind of just fade out. He had this like that sort of iPhone setting of like soft focus around because he just couldn't deal with corners.
Yeah. They're a nightmare. They are really hard.
And whenever you pick up a newspaper review of your work or a thing, the thing that most people begin to try and get their teeth into right at the beginning is this sort of battle that plays out in your work constantly between figuration and abstraction. And you've had this conversation 700 times, and I don't want to dwell on it for too long tonight, but I am really interested in it because I've just written a catalogue essay for a group of drawings that Cecily has done, which are now in Manchester. And I love these little, I sort of called them like hooks, when I was sort of flailing around in one of your paintings, and there was something suddenly to hold on to.
Yeah.
And I'd sort of hold on to it for a while, and then I'd let go, and I'd flail around for a while, and then I'd find another kind of grip.
Yeah.
Are you having to, I know this is a really daft question, so humor me, but are you having to suppress the figuration or suppress the abstraction, or is it, do some pictures naturally become more legible than others? Or
I feel like I'm constantly trying to make it more figurative, and that I'll paint with something very specific in mind, and but I don't want to really describe it, but I'll have something very particular in mind as I paint, and then I'll step back after a couple of hours and it'll look quite abstract, and it's often a bit of a surprise. I sort of think, where did it go? You know, that sounds a bit disingenuous, but it will really be, you know, say I want to paint somebody pulling off their shirt, and I don't want to do it in a straightforward figurative way, so I'm trying to sort of invent a new way to say that, but I'm thinking the whole time of shirt, arm, neck, tension, and sort of trying to come at it from different directions. And while I'm in it, I really feel like that's what's there, and it is often a bit of a shock that when I step back, I realize that it's not actually clear to a viewer. Now, the hope is that the tightrope that you manage to be on manages to say shirt, neck, tension without describing it, so that you get the sense of it. And I think it is possible in a roundabout way. You know, there are people who I think do it very well, where you know it's all there, but the mystery is like, how am I getting that from this? I mean, Bacon talked about, you know, that even in the less figurative paintings, that always wanting there to be the trail of a human presence, right? I mean, so there's that sort of idea that without really putting the whole figure there with all the eyelashes and fingernails, that you can have the sense of a human presence.
The pieces are there.
So I always I always think of myself as figurative. It always surprises me to be described as more abstract. I mean, in a painting like this, it's a very deliberate, you know, I was trying to put in these pretty clear figurative landscapes, and then I felt that with a clear ground or a clear place where the action was taking place, the figures themselves could get more abstract, and that, yes, in this case, the trees are sort of the hook, or the blue sky, so the color can be a hook. But I really liked your description of the hook, and I realize I do that, and often, if I'm flailing about, because I'll find I'm flailing about while I'm painting, and in a way it's a very dumb idea, but it does help me to sort of, like with the shipwrecks, suddenly the oar, so at least you know where the oar is, and then if you follow the oar, you'll be like, oh, so there's the edge of the boat. And in some of the paintings of shipwrecks, I mean, I call them all shipwrecks now, they're not all exactly that, but of people in boats, it's all that really remains of the shipwreck subject is the edge of the boat, which has become this very useful device. to sort of contain the energy, because they're really crowds of figures. And I flail in my own work, and so having these devices to sort of keep the chaos at bay are very helpful, both while painting and when looking.
And when you're painting, are you constantly stepping back and going in? Do you have to stop yourself from going back sometimes?
I'm not constantly stepping back. I use a mirror a lot, so I turn around a lot and look in the mirror. But sometimes, I'll often paint for a few hours without really looking. I always then think I should have looked more, perhaps. But I tend to paint and not look, and then look at the end of the day, or take a break and look, and then see what to do. But I'm not very good at looking while I'm painting. It tends to be paint, 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 and then look.
Yeah. I thought it would be interesting to show everybody an example of where you have actually worked from Rubens directly. This is a painting which Rubens painted together with Jan Bruegel the Elder, a painting called The Earthly Paradise with the Fall of Man. And it's in the Mauritshuis in The Hague. An amazing painting. Rubens has painted the figures, and Bruegel has painted the flora and fauna. And you painted, I think, 3 works after it. I think you may have shown this here in Vienna at Lisa Reuter Gallery. And this is now in the collection of the Sammlung Essel at the Albertina. So it's a painting that's in Vienna. And I've done the silly thing of putting them together again, but what was it? Can you talk just a little bit about what drew you to this? I know now, after visiting the show with you today, what drew you to this composition, but was it, I've only got one of your 3 sort of versions after it, but was it, what was it about this one in particular? Was it the collaborative nature of it that had interested you? No?
No. I mean, often what happens is I'll just have a postcard. Whenever I go to a museum, I buy a ton of postcards. I always dread the day that museums stop making them, because I think people take so many pictures now that maybe the museums will just think. I always want to tell people, just go and buy the postcard and stop taking a picture. But anyway, so I think I just had this postcard, and I'd have these postcards kicking around, and sometimes, one's in need of something new to paint, or maybe it just happened to be sitting there. So I don't think there was any plan or build-up, and I think it was mostly to do with wanting a figure with a raised arm. It was really simple. That drew me to it. And I've also, it sounds so childish, but I've always loved paintings with animals in them. And particularly now, and I've done all these paintings in the last couple of years that go back to this, of paintings of paradise, or paintings of Orpheus playing to the animals. There always just seems like a real poignancy to sort of a disappearing world. And
have you ever taken a source image and only ever used it once? Because I feel that you always mine them repeatedly.
No, not really. And this is where I would like to mention Rubens and the way he did that. Because the big shock to me about this show was how much he did that, and which made him sound to me like such a contemporary artist. Although I suppose people have always done that, and now we think we're, we all, I feel I'm a total magpie, and I take what I need from wherever it is, and always looking at things. But, looking at things, storing them up, and then when they're helpful, you sort of pluck them out of the air. So that's why I just think looking at art all the time is so essential for a painter. But you don't know when you're going to need something, and you might look at something and not need it for years, or have a postcard and not need it. But so I'll use something, like I used that figure, especially the Eve, made 2 or 3 paintings, and then didn't really think about her again. But next time I needed a figure with an arm raised, there it was in my sort of lexicon. So you can sort of store up these images.
Galinda explained that so nicely to us today, because Rubens obviously didn't have access to postcards.
No.
So he would literally sketch things and have his sketchbooks as his sort of desktop.
Exactly.
So it's a much more kind of labor-intensive way of doing it, like travel the world, sketch things. But of course he could sketch so beautifully that he sort of...
Yeah.
But I agree with you. The big shock for me seeing this exhibition was just how much of a magpie he was.
Yeah.
And it's laid out so beautifully that you can see where this sculpture falls in this painting. And
yeah. I mean, I'm actually going to quote from one of the essays in the catalogue. It's, and forgive my pronunciation, but Anita or Agneta Georgievska Shine. It's artists should imbibe, I think Rubens said this, or she says it, that Rubens. Artists should imbibe diverse models, and there should be a constant perusal and digestion of multiple sources, which I love the idea of imbibing and digesting, and that really hit a nerve with me. And and I think Rubens did say this, use selective imitation to provide the mind with a treasury of images it can draw from as needed, and that the new is born from perusal and recombination of the old. And I just thought, oh, that's what I do. You know, that's what everyone does, I suppose, especially these days, but because we've got so much to draw from. But this idea that if you want to be an artist, what else would you do than go to already existing art, and it's all there. And there wasn't really a tradition of drawing from life in those days, so you look at the classical art and antiquity, and you look at other people's art and who came just before you. And Rubens actually drew on other people's drawings, which is quite shocking, I think, to us today.
It's the most amazing thing. If you haven't seen this show, there are drawings where Rubens has bought someone else's drawing and just kind of carried it on.
Yeah.
It was just like...
I think he'd go and buy great sheaths of other people's work. And I mean, I actually did this once in a hotel room in Athens. The painting on the wall was really annoying me because there was just this, and I actually got out my pencils and worked on this painting because it was just really bothering me that I just knew that if just with a few extra shadows, it would sit more nicely.
You need to give me the name of that hotel later. What you were saying is really interesting, and there's an amazing quote from T.S. Eliot about how the new is born from the old.
Yeah.
But also about how, if the new is good enough, it can also completely change our reading of the old.
Yeah.
So, and it's kind of the basis for everything I'm trying to do in this museum, is not just to use Rembrandt and Caravaggio to sprinkle some stardust on living artists, but to see how the work of really great living artists here can change, I don't say improve, but I say change or add depth to something we already think is a locked-in, unqualified masterpiece.
Well, it's just really helpful to look at something with fresh eyes, and it's hard to see things fresh. We're used to them, and just having something else sort of intervene can really help.
I've got a couple more paintings of yours, which are made 20 years apart. This wonderful painting on the town from 1998, which looks very, very bright and orangey on the screen. It's redder and pinker in real life. And then this painting, which I love, from 2014, called The Nymphs. The Nymphs Have Departed. And again, I've taken a Rubens painting, which is this wonderful painting from the Prado called Diana and Her Nymphs, Surprised by the Fawns. And this is the last kind of side-by-side, because otherwise this is getting boring. But the reason I wanted to put these on the screen together is one thing you've often said about historical painting is that you feel really jealous of the source material they had. Religion, mythology. You've always had this fascination in conflict and turbulence, and there's so much conflict and turbulence there. Is it as much how they're painting and how great they were at painting as their subject matters? Oh, yeah, but I feel these days, if you're a painter, you can feel like there's not really any point to it, you know, because we're not recording, and there are just so many other ways that one can comment on the world that are more efficient or more direct. So I think what I've said I'm jealous of is you can't really do a Massacre of the Innocents today. I mean, I've done Paradise. I am actually sort of slowly working my way through a lot of really old subjects. But the myths, for example, I think that's a bit cheesy, and it doesn't really speak to, yeah, sure, you can use it in a symbolic way, but like I would avoid doing anything with a mythical subject. I mean, what I'm not jealous of is commissions, because I'd hate to have to work to order. And I think we're lucky today that if you can work with galleries and just sort of show when you want to, that's great luxury. And just get on with it. And I think Rubens did that a bit. You know, there were some works that he did sort of for himself.
And in a way, us contemporary artists are selfishly doing all of it for ourselves in the hope that you can put some of it into the world and it'll be seen or appreciated. But it was very much the way it was painted. I mean, I went to the Slade, but not at a time when anyone knew how to teach painting, really. I mean, I think there was a class for that I wasn't really interested in, but it was very much sort of like go and express yourself. There was no sort of formal teaching. And just to mention, you said about my parents, but I only grew up with my mum, so I wasn't around art a lot till I was older. My mum and my stepdad. So even though my father was a critic, I didn't grow up surrounded and absorbed in art.
You say you couldn't paint a massacre of the innocents now, but I remember having this epiphany standing with one of our curators in front of in our Bruegel room and saying to them, why is this painting of Christ carrying his cross to Calvary? Why is it so shocking? And the curator said to me, what most people don't realize is that every person in this painting is wearing the clothes of Bruegel's time. They're not wearing biblical clothes. They're wearing contemporary fashion.
Yeah.
Which is like Christ wearing Adidas, carrying his cross.
Yeah.
And that would be a deeply shocking thing to see a contemporary crucifixion. So he was doing it. I mean...
But they didn't have photography. I mean, that's obviously the huge thing that changed everything. And they didn't have film. I mean, we were talking earlier, it was Galinda who said that she thought, no, it wasn't, it was the conservator, Elke, who said that she thought Bruegel would have been a filmmaker if he were around today. We were talking about Carnival and Lent, one of my favorite paintings in the world, and it's here. I mean, that painting, I know we're actually going to talk about it, aren't we? But no, so that's what I mean. I think about Massacre of the Innocents, and it will enter into it, but I wouldn't want to depict it. And partly because of the horrendous news and just how ghastly the world is, and every day is such an onslaught of hideous real life, that I think there's something trite about putting it into art. I mean, I think some people manage very well to make topical art that deal with what's actually happening, but I have to go about it in a more roundabout way. So if the world suddenly became a nice place, perhaps I'd feel better about painting something really unspeakable.
Need something to kick against. The last Rubens exhibition that I saw was this exhibition at the Royal Academy, which I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah.
You did?
I was in it.
Yeah, I know you were in it.
Yeah.
That's why I want to talk about.
Oh, yeah.
But I actually really didn't enjoy this show, and this cemented forever my dislike of Rubens, which Galinda has now uncemented again. But it was a really bad show, and I just want to read the first line of the Financial Times review of this exhibition. Pompous, pragmatic, flashy, shallow. No old master is in greater need of reviving for contemporary taste and rescuing from cliched response than Peter Paul Rubens, the eloquent, erudite, and now remote pioneer of the Flemish Baroque. He's been out of fashion for generations. Van Gogh called him superficial, hollow, and bombastic. And to audiences reared on modernism's introspection and angst, Rubens's easy self-confidence was totally foreign. And I read that and I was like, yes, every word of it I sign up for. And now I wish the person who wrote this could come and look at these pictures and understand it. But I was interested in this because is there something about the unfashionability of Rubens that you find makes him, or do you not find him at all unfashionable? I wondered if the unfashionability provided a way in to him in a way that someone about whom there is no controversy, you know, there are a lot of people, a lot of Rubens lovers, a lot of Rubens haters, makes him a really fertile kind of subject. Isn't it?
I don't know. I think I read that. I was really surprised. And, you know, I don't think I'm that aware of who's fashionable and who isn't. Because from when I was at art school, I felt like I've always looked at a lot of older art, sort of more than most of my friends did. Even though people always say, oh, I love Bosch or whoever it is. Certainly as a student, I was more at the National Gallery more than most of my peers. And I don't know. I mean, another thing is I love Delacroix, and I think maybe my love of Delacroix, there's this sort of going back. So there's Picasso. Picasso looks at Delacroix, and you look at Delacroix through Picasso's eyes, and then Delacroix looked at Rubens, so you end up looking at Rubens through Delacroix's eyes. And I don't know. I think I always thought people, if they didn't like it, it was the sort of chocolate boxy thing, and partly maybe just because people don't like a lot of flesh these days, and because of the fashion for being skinny, that maybe people are just, you know, can't deal with that amount of, that people find it vulgar to actually see that amount of bared flesh.
That was actually something we all commented on today when we were walking through the show. It's like, no one has got any clothes on, ever.
Yeah. Yeah, my daughter, who's 8, pointed out, and I'm looking over my shoulder at the catalogue, well, why are they all naked all the time?
It's a very good question, actually. This was your painting in the exhibition.
Yeah.
The only good part, and I'm sorry that this is being recorded and going on YouTube because I'll lose a friend at the Royal Academy, but it was actually a really good show. The only really good part of it was at the very end of the show, there was a room which Jenny Saville had curated where she brought together around 15 or so objects, one by each artist. So there was Freud, there was Bacon, there was de Kooning, and this was your piece, a painting called The Young and the Restless. Was this something you made with the show in mind? Did Jenny choose this particularly? How did it find its way in
No,
there?
it was just fortunate that I'd just been working on, I just happened to have just finished a painting that seemed appropriate. The fact that it was very fleshy, which not that many paintings had been in the last few years. Fleshy and muscular and sort of looked somewhat like it was looking at the classical. No, so it was just very lucky. I was telling you earlier, my allergy to working for a show. So she'd asked and I didn't have anything. I wouldn't have been able to do the show.
If you'd been asked to paint a piece for that show, you wouldn't?
No, I wouldn't have done it.
Only
because I get so self-conscious that I found out very early on after I started showing that if I ever paint with a person or a show in mind, it really does, makes me too self-conscious. I think because I am quite sort of romantic in that I have to be able to ruin everything, and I also don't know, I don't have days where I think, okay, that really works. It usually takes a couple of days for me to figure out whether something's working or not. So.
And you talked about often just letting it sit for a while and going back to it. And
yeah. And then if you've got a deadline, that's always sort of hanging over you, and it affects that, because I want to be able to put something away for a few months if necessary, and not look at it.
There was a great quote on the wall of this room by William de Kooning, and it said, "Flesh was the reason that oil paint was invented." And it kind of could have been under almost everyone's paintings in that room, because it sort of felt like a brethren of flesh lovers.
Yeah. That was really what always drew me to Rubens in the end. Rubens and Titian was the flesh.
It's so interesting to see Rubens and Titian across from each other today, because the flesh is utterly different.
It's so different, yeah. And both of them, they're unrecognizably themselves, which is also just so hard to pin down, especially, I mean, perhaps a writer could do it, but to describe exactly what's going on and why Rubens always looks like Rubens and Titian always looks like Titian, but what the difference is.
I just wanted to tell you a little story about the very first Rubens show I ever saw. And it was still the most appropriate place to see Rubens I've ever seen Rubens. So this is Las Vegas. This is a hotel called the Venetian, which they built so that Americans who don't have passports can still go to Venice. And it was built by the man who's just persuaded Donald Trump to move the capital of Israel to Jerusalem. So he's a very nice man called Sheldon Adelson, and he owns Caesar's Palace and Luxor, and he just builds cities in the desert. And I was living in Venice at the time, and this was
the real Venice.
The real Venice. Yeah, I don't think anyone, I mean, maybe people, I would often, so the Guggenheim had a museum for a while in Las Vegas, together with the Hermitage and the Kunsthistorisches Museum. And I would often courier paintings So I remember taking a Modigliani painting, and I left Venice on the boat on the Grand Canal, went under the Rialto, got out at Tronchetto into a truck, drove to Munich, flew to Los Angeles, got in a truck, drove through the desert, got to Las Vegas, went down the Grand Canal under the Rialto. And I was like, it was just completely bonkers. And we couldn't, it was the weirdest thing. And it was very funny because I remember it was always a nightmare because the Guggenheim couldn't afford for us to stay in this hotel because it was so expensive. So they put us in the Mirage, and I would arrive in my room about 2 o'clock in the morning. I remember getting into bed, not having slept for 36 hours, and then 10 minutes later, an artificial volcano erupted under my window, and it erupted on the hour, every hour. I was like, I am in hell. But I just wanted to bring this up because I just can't think of anywhere. This is a gondolier playing his accordion, and these are the Rubens Banners. And this was the entrance to the exhibition. I don't know if any of you ever saw this museum, but all the walls were made of corten steel, designed by Nicolas, and all the paintings hung on magnets. And by the end of the exhibition, they were all about 6 inches lower, because they slid really slowly. And the guy who invented this system was a friend of mine called Ciro. And Ciro found these magnets in Italy in a shop. And he had one in his pocket once, and on the way home, he got stuck to his car. And literally, it had to, like, 6 men had to pull him off. But seeing Rubens on corten steel, and the corten steel was intended to simulate the fabric of museums like the Kunsthistorische. These are the paintings from...
Was that Rem Koolhaas's idea, the steel?
That was Rem Koolhaas's idea. I don't even know if these are Rubens' paintings, because this is Galinda saying no. It was Rubens in his circle. Right. I couldn't find an image of the actual Rubens pictures, but seeing Rubens in Las Vegas on corten steel with kind of go-go dancers on the other side of the wall and strip shows and Evander Holyfield boxing, he felt perfectly at home. So there was no question here, but I just wanted to say where my dislike of Rubens has come from and what my thing was. We've got one last Rubens thing. Now, this is your Instagram feed, and I love your Instagram feed because you feed us a regular update of what's cooking in the studio, and I like how you do it. And I remember you once saying to me, do you like it? Is it too much? Because some artists just literally cake you in the stuff, and some artists are very reticent, and I think you found a very middle ground. But this is one particular mashup that you did, and I just wanted to ask you how it came about, and obviously the climate that we're living in a very funny moment in the world at the moment. And I don't want to get into your responsibility as someone who's a public figure to address this and so on, but what provoked you and what led you to put this together? Because I think it's brilliant.
Well, it's this is actually a friend, Jonathan Horowitz, the artist. You know, a lot of us in New York and America, well, everywhere, but in New York, once after the election last year, I'm not going to say his name, you know, people were just in such a state and sort of getting together and saying, what can we do? And immediately a few things popped up, you know, whether they were little protest groups and just ideas to do things to utterly useless, probably, but just as a way to feel that you were doing something, I think felt a bit better than the sort of helpless wave of despair that engulfed the country. So this friend, Jonathan Horowitz, started this thing called the Daily Trumpet, which it's taken over his life, I think, because it's a lot more work than he realized, because he's finding an artist for every day of his presidency to make a work about the current climate. So it was just one of those things that when Jonathan asked me, I don't actually know why I thought of doing this. I think, to be honest, I should have been more prepared.
Bacchus is a pretty great...
It's actually Silenus.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and I did hesitate because I love Rubens, and I actually kind of like Silenus, and I love Bacchus. So I sort of thought, can I really do this to poor old Silenus and his friends? But it was just too perfect. I'm sorry, I should have thought of this when you asked me for this image, but I don't actually remember what made me think of using this image. Just, I think it had been on my mind because immediately so many friends were getting together and saying, we need to make posters, we need to make t-shirts, we need to make badges, we need to, you know, we were all immediately making protest signs. So, you know, I was thinking all the time about new ways to make imagery that would maybe be some kind of protest. But I mean, I think you have to have humor.
I think what's really also great about it is in a lot of old master paintings, these famous figures have their kind of crews. They have their entourage.
Right, yeah.
And Trump has this crazy cast of characters around him, each one of whom is more ridiculous than the next. And you've sort of perfectly, this guy's got his entourage.
Yes.
And they're all sort of blindly going along with this kind of dancing to the tune.
And I have to say, someone who works in my studio helped me do this, because I'm not very techno. So, yeah, Alex Gibson.
So we're going to leave, we're kind of going to half leave Rubens behind. These two paintings are paintings by an artist called Otto Van Veen, which, maybe to my shame, I had never heard of until about a year ago when Gerlinde Gruber found them upstairs in our Sekundär Gallery. They had never, ever been shown publicly in 400 years. And the one on the right is in the Rubens exhibition on a beautiful wall. And the one on the left is currently in the Secession in an exhibition of new works by the American artist Rebecca Quaitman. And I put this in because we had the chance today to see both of these pictures in different environments, and I just wanted to sort of get your take on them, because I was imagining you may have been seeing this artist's work for the first time today. And they're pretty extraordinary pictures.
Yeah, they're extraordinary. I mean, the gestures of the women in both, can you see well enough here? Yeah, so, I mean, they seem particularly relevant today with everything that's been going on in the last few weeks, particularly in America. Sort of, well, especially the one on the left, this expression, pussy bites back, that has become very popular back home. But they're extraordinary images. The one that's in the Rubens show, the one of the woman raising her shirt, it's hung with the Judgment of Paris. I kind of like the fact that it feels almost like, because the Judgment of Paris really annoys me as a subject. So like, you know, I want to paint a picture of Paris being judged. Like, get your kit off and let us see what, you know, because the arrogance of Paris and the way he's just, you know, sizing up these women, and they're just waiting for him to decide who's the most beautiful, and who's he to say? Anyway, it's particularly irritating as a subject, even if they're very beautiful paintings. But in a way, they sum up all the things that are wrong with Western art, you know, and that we just take for granted, of like the female body, you know, receiving the gaze of the male, blah, blah. But here she is, sort of very brazenly exposing herself for us, and you feel like it's totally her choice. She's full frontal, which is unusual. And then this combined with the second one, which I saw a few hours after the first, where they're actually raising their skirts. One of my thoughts was just, who knew that they were naked under those skirts all this time? Because they're wearing, you know, they're very respectable otherwise. And you think of all these thousands of paintings around the world where they're all wearing these long skirts and then never really thought about what they were wearing underneath.
They're all Scottish.
Perhaps it makes sense that then they're naked in so many other pictures.
And Gerlinde made the point that Rubens was not drawing from life. And he may have never seen a naked woman until he was a certain age. And so he just paints a young man and kind of, as you did that gesture, just kind of like whaps two breasts on a naked man. And, okay, so
I must say, the one on the right reminds me of the Degas Young Spartans, one of my favorite Degas, with the figures, the males on the right and the females on the left, sort of getting ready to spar, and the sort of classical background.
So we're going to move on to this chap, Bruegel. It's one of the most remarkable galleries of paintings anywhere in the world. There are 12 paintings that normally hang in the Bruegel room, all made during a 10-year period between 1559 and when he died in 1569. And this is an artist and a specific work that has occupied Cecily for a really long period of time. I'm going to really flash through. First is a group of ink on paper drawings from studies from 2007. Now they're vast. How big are these in real life?
About this big.
Okay, like a sort of
So
sketchbook,
like a
piece of paper. And I'm just going to kind of scroll through them. And what I really love about these, and it's, I don't know when they stop, I think this is the last one, yeah, is that they sort of, you dive into the work. Do you begin with a fragment always as a way in?
I mean, the truth is, often I stop because something was in the wrong place. So they look more like there's more of an idea behind doing this fragment. But when I draw, I almost always draw from another source. I almost always copy other art. And really what I'm doing is trying to figure out how the drawing works, like how is it pieced together. So, you know, often I start, and I'm very strict with myself. There are very strict rules when I'm copying, because it really isn't about making a nice drawing. It's all about getting information. It's really almost a document. It's a factual investigation. So I want to draw these three figures, and I want to figure out where they are in relation to that wooden form, and how big the well is, and where does the pig come out. And if I get to the pig, and his ear is in the wrong place in relation to that woman's shoe, I've got to start again. So they end up as these fragments. And that's not to say, I mean, I liked them and ended up showing them as these fragments. And, you know, but after the fact, I felt that the fragments were almost indicative of the way that one looks at a work of art. Sure. And certainly when you copy, you know, that it's, especially with something like the Bruegel, that it's almost overwhelming that there's so much to see.
And is the reproduction sitting next to you as a postcard or something from a book? Or?
Yeah. But that in a way, just sort of honing in on one fragment is a way of sort of not being overwhelmed and just sort of starting with one moment and then going from there. But if things end up in the right place, because it's all about looking really closely, and it's this, if anyone tries doing it, I mean, you'll see how it's very hard to copy something like this. Sure. And you have to really be paying very close attention.
And if you feel that it's gone astray, do you start the next one from that
I just
spot?
start from, there's no rule about where to start again, but there are certain parts of the painting that I might have been drawn to again and again, like I love that guy with the eggs around his neck. I'm obsessed with him. And I love these three, especially the little guy in the sort of bee suit, and the figure of Lent herself. Well, in fact, there are many, many moments, but there's a way that through copying, you really sort of internalize the image. And
the first time that I saw these, what they reminded me of was this amazing study that the National Gallery in London did a few years ago, where they put a sensor behind, I think, 6 different paintings, and they could tell what people had looked at in the paintings, how you read a painting. Yeah. And they realized that in some of their most famous paintings, 2/3 of the painting was never, ever looked at, but you might as well just like cut it off.
Right.
Just was, I mean, obviously. And people dart, their eyes dart around, and they feel that they've kind of taken from something what they need. Mm-hmm. But they presented the studies, the results of this investigation in a really similar way. Right. Areas that had not been looked at were completely kind of bleached out. Right. And
oh, I'd love to see that. I mean, probably the bottom third a lot of the time, because it's doing its job, but you're not really aware that it's telling you where to look. This
is actually one museum in the world where the bottom third of the picture is looked at, because we have this crazy wood up to here. Right. So every painting only starts here. Right.
In fact, when I say bottom third, it should really be more like the bottom eighth. Yeah. The bottom third's pushing it a bit. But no, I really like that idea. And I did think after the fact that they, you know, when I look at the drawings, when I've made 20 drawings or something, you will see, you know, I think it does echo the sort of the way that one's eyes really go in and pick out different moments.
And
then I went back to it years later.
This is 10 years later. Yeah. This is last year.
Yeah.
So I think there are 4 slides here. These have got a fulsomeness to them.
Oh, when I go wrong, like in these, if something was in the wrong place, you know, I'm allowed to move it over. So, but if something's miles away from something else, you know, I'll just redraw it. So you often see something twice or 3 times. Well, it just has to get moved over. But
and is that you just being more forgiving of yourself now than you would have been 10 years ago, or that's it's a different technique because you've?
I think I would just drive myself crazy that I would never ever manage to get every single figure in if I didn't allow myself to move people around. But it is such a good. I didn't mean to just say, oh, it's really difficult. Like, look at me. It was more that it's this really good test for it really keeps your brain and eye and hand sort of fine-tuned, I think, to make yourself, you realize that you just have to look so hard to copy something that closely. It's a bit like if you ever try and copy something back to front, that'll drive you mad, but, you know, try and have the figures facing the other way and copy them. But I think they're probably very good anti-Alzheimer's things like.
There was a lovely exhibition of your work not too long ago at the Drawing Center in New York, and it had a very nice title, which was Rehearsal. And I think that was a very careful choice of word, because you have, you know, there's the process of copying, there's a process of repeating. Rehearsal suggests preparing for something, which is really interesting in respect, certainly drawings. It implies going at something over and over again.
Yeah.
And I think it was such a beautifully chosen word to describe what you're doing here. But it's more than just rehearsing, because rehearsing implies a grand performance.
Right, yes.
I think you're really just trying to understand how on earth this picture is made, and how is it put together, and how do all the parts fit together.
Yeah, the title was Claire Gilman's idea, the curator, and at first I thought, I didn't want it to sound as if the drawings are rehearsals for the paintings, which are then the big moment, because it's not like that at all. But the idea of just going over something over and over and over in order to learn it, like a dancer would, because I think there's really something in that what I'm doing in the drawings, it really is, I mean, I overuse this word, but you really do internalize it. You not only get it really inside the painting. Sometimes now I feel if I haven't drawn something, I haven't fully seen it, and that you just see it so differently once you've drawn it. And in fact, when I got to Carnival and Lent, when I got here on Saturday, it's very sort of almost uncanny feeling, because I mean, it's not something of like seeing an old friend, it's really coming face to face with something I feel like I know every inch of really well, and that it's like, oh, there's that person and that figure, and it's always so different when you see something in the flesh, having worked from it in reproduction so much.
And this is, we're back to your Instagram again, but Whitney, who works with you at the studio, sent me this really interesting note to say that you had ordered this puzzle from our museum website, which I'm really proud of. And it had actually, when someone else had fragmented Bruegel for you, a puzzle maker had taken Bruegel apart for you, you learned something again about.
Well, in fact, those last few drawings, the ones with color, were done while I was doing the puzzle. So I love jigsaw puzzles, especially of paintings, and my other favorite is Bosch. It's like copying, that you just learn so much about the painting, and that I didn't want to spoil your puzzle slide, but that's the other thing when I saw Carnival and Lent, because from doing the jigsaw, I just, you know, I feel like I've really lived in that painting.
You said
and the same with I've done a puzzle of Bosch, Garden of Earthly Delights, about 5 times, and I swear I could, you know, go over every inch of that painting with my eyes closed. And Elke was saying that today, because we were talking about conserving a painting, how you must remember it so well. I mean, a conservator who actually gets to touch these works, I mean, probably no one knows them better, but you were asking if she dreams about them. But I was thinking, through drawing and doing these puzzles, I just feel like it's this, and I don't think you have to be an artist to do this either. I'd say, as a way to understand a painting, it's a sort of huge gift to then you've got it in your head forever. Just through the process of doing this, because it just forces you to look so closely. But there's this almost magical thing. I know I'm such an old lady with my puzzles, but But it is this almost magical thing where once you get to know it, you'll pick up a little piece and you'll just know, you know, exactly where it goes, from the size of the mark or the scale of the boot. And you get incredibly intimate with the painting.
And you also had the opportunity to create your own puzzle.
This painting's called Carnival and Lent, and that's from about 10 years ago. Yeah, I hate my own puzzle, though.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Because
I'm really happy I don't have to do this as a puzzle. I mean, I would never get any work done for the rest of my life.
I thought it was torture, and it also showed me everything that was wrong with my painting.
Really? I quite like this painting.
I love the painting.
But not as a puzzle, okay.
But as a puzzle, it really showed me like where it wasn't as strong as it should have been.
Am I right in thinking this was only produced in an edition of 30? Can that be? Or was it mass-produced?
I can't remember.
Okay,
a friend did it who had a company doing like artist projects. I think it was more than 30.
Really?
It was very hard to find someone to make a nice puzzle. That's the other thing, the color wasn't very good. So it wasn't pleasurable. Like, you have to do a good quality puzzle, like the Kunsthistorisches puzzles.
Yeah.
But if they're not a nice quality, it's just not a pleasure. It's got to be a sensual pleasure.
So I thought it would be really interesting for everyone to conclude the discussion with a little bit of a talk about what Cecily's been up to recently. And Cecily stumbled across a reproduction, very small image of this painting by Delacroix of Christ asleep during the Tempest, which is a painting in the collection of the Met in New York, in a review of an exhibition in London, actually. And you kind of followed a similar path that you did with the Bruegel, in the sense that, I mean, there was a very intense burst of works on paper. How many of these exist?
I think there are about 35 in Manchester, but I'm actually still working on this subject a year later. And it was one of those serendipitous moments where I didn't feel like I was groping around for a subject. But that's that thing about being jealous of the past, that, you know, the panic is always like, what if I don't know what to paint next? And you always hope that I always think of my work as one big body of work, but that one thing, you kind of start slipping away from it and hoping that something else sort of comes along, and overlap. But when I found that little shipwreck, I did one drawing of it, and then I just, you know, it just really grabbed me, and I did another and another and another.
And you said that a few days later, you know, there was a photograph on the front cover of the New York Times of one of these desperate scenes of people crammed into a boat crossing the Mediterranean 500 years, 400 years later, and you realize that, you know, there was a prescience is the wrong word, but there was a topicality and a contemporaneous to this subject matter. Not that that made it any more fascinating or relevant or rewarding for you, but it struck a chord, definitely.
I mean, I think I realized that as soon as I started drawing from the painting, but then the photographs that were being published last summer had a very physical similarity to the paintings I was working from. And I did try a little bit to draw from the news photographs, but it was not.
Yeah.
I realized I do need the sort of distance of working from art, even if it's talking about the same subject.
And this leads you to this painting. Yeah. So this is The Raft of the Medusa by Géricault in Paris. And I know that there was a certain reticence involved coming from Delacroix to this. You're thinking, you know, dare I?
Well, just because it's such a superstar painting. You know, you were saying earlier about how there are star paintings and star artists. And yeah, it's true that I've worked from a lot of big stars, but not such a star painting, really. Like, I'll take something from all different people, but to actually copy such a seminal work. But once I started drawing from it, I just got so hooked, because, again, this is one of the ones where I didn't feel I'd ever really seen it till I started copying it. And I just understood so much more about the structure of it through copying it over and over.
But again, when you see the drawings, I would look at them, and I've actually I think there are quite a few preparatory drawings by Géricault for this as well, which look like people are just sort of, you know, having a pipe on a Sunday afternoon, not like, you know, about to die on a raft off Africa. But when I saw your drawings of this, again, you'd honed in on things. And if I'd seen them without knowing where they'd come from, I don't know that I would have latched onto them.
Right.
So there are this led to this wonderful, wonderful group of paintings, which Cecily just showed at Paula Cooper Gallery in New York. There are 4 pictures I'm going to just show now to finish up, all from 2016. This is the title.
This is Madhurapura Shipwreck.
And how large is this?
This, oh God. I never remember measurements. It's really big.
In relation to the screen?
Oh, bigger. It's a lot bigger. This is, oh God, I wish I knew that.
I mean, the really ginormous one is
that's
this.
33 feet. And I know you will do meters.
33 feet. It's a lot of meters.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I don't know how many feet the others are. I think they're about 12 feet.
12 meters?
That's very lame of
11
me not
meters,
to know.
yeah. So this is called A Day, Help, Help, Another Day. Which, was that also the title of the show?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then
there's a figure in the center who comes straight from the Delacroix. We don't have a clicker, do we? A little light thingy? That you can, in the central, so it's a triptych, there's 3 panels, and the bigger panel, this guy, with his back to us, he's straight from the Delacroix painting, and he's very much the hook in there, because I think the thing that a lot of the response I got, people didn't read any of the imagery at first, and then, in a way, once you see one figure, you start seeing. It helps you read the others. It's almost
like your eyes adjusting. It's like those sort of silly things we used to look at school, where you had to kind of like do something with your eyes, and then suddenly this whole image would come out. It's like these are not silly in the same way, but you have to kind of find a frequency sometimes. And then there's 2 more: Sirens and Shipwrecks and Bathers in the Band. And then my favorite of all, which has the perfect title, When Time Ran Out, because this is the last slide I wanted to have up today. This actually brings us really nicely back to some of the images that we're looking at right at the beginning, sort of from a long time ago, because it has that, the very first one actually that we put together with Venus Fest, because it has there's just enough in there, the blue sky, the sort of slither of blue sky, the green, the landscape behind, the landscape at the bottom, to feel that I'm looking at some totally slaughterous kind of déjeuner sur l'herbe. But there's just enough in there to convince you that there are things in there, and yet you're thrown off constantly.
I mean, I think the whole figuration abstraction thing, one thing that's tricky about it, and you saying you need to sort of tune in, that's a way I like of describing it. But what I never wanted is a sort of now you see it, now you don't sort of game. I mean, there is a playfulness, but I don't want it to look like an abstract mess that then suddenly you're like, oh, I saw it, and then that's it. The whole point for me is that you might take a minute to start reading some imagery, but that, a slower read will keep rewarding you, and that you will actually see more and more. And it's not that it's hidden imagery. It really is more that just it needs a little time for you to start seeing things. And I also very much like reading things from different distances. Well, who doesn't? But I think, it's always a surprise, because with that really massive painting, I'd never actually really seen it. In my studio, I couldn't get very far back from it at all. And so it wasn't until I saw it in the gallery that I knew that it had worked, but that it looks totally different from a distance, and then up close you really see far more of the actual imagery.
It's amazing that you find a gallery that can accommodate a 35-foot painting.
Yeah,
I mean, they say that Jackson Pollock only painted a big picture when Peggy Guggenheim left New York and gave him to Betty Parsons, because she had bigger walls, so he painted bigger pictures, and that's when abstract expressionism kind of got big. Just before we go, the exhibition of this is an old poster I've just noticed, but the exhibition runs until the 21st of January. If you haven't seen it and you don't like Rubens, see it, because you will like Rubens. And if you haven't seen it and you do like Rubens, go and see it. A little look forward to our talks next year. We will be inviting 4 artists to come and talk about their work and their interests. Catherine Opie, photographer from Los Angeles, Kerry James Marshall, wonderful painter from Chicago, Steve McQueen, the filmmaker, and Fiona Tan, wonderful filmmaker, originally from Indonesia, who lives in Amsterdam. All four of them will be in an exhibition that we are opening here in March next year called The Shape of Time, the first group exhibition we've tried to do. This is a work by Felix González Torres, which we will be having in the exhibition. Later in the year, these two lovely people, Wes Anderson and Juman Malouf. Wes, a film director that many of you will know, and Juman is a wonderful, a trained stage designer and a wonderful children's book author, are curating our collection next year in September. They have carte blanche of several 100,000 million objects to choose from 14 different collections. And this will open here in September next year, and then we'll travel to the Prada Foundation in Italy. And the big highlight for next year that we all need to get very excited about now is Bruegel. And it's the first ever survey exhibition of Peter Bruegel the Elder. It's been about 7 or 8 years in the making. It is going to be one of the most remarkable exhibitions that any of us ever see. Cecily's already about to book a plane ticket to come back and see it. It's going to be truly astonishing, and this is the only place it can happen because we have most of the Bruegels of the world and they never leave here. So come and see it. I'd like to say thank you very much to our contemporary patrons group who helped make all of these talks possible. Our sponsors, RSM and Parnasse and the Hotel Sans Souci. All of my wonderful colleagues at the museum who put on these talks. My assistant Judith, who's done a lot of research and help. Whitney and Louis at your studio, who are brilliant and have helped source a lot of images. Thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you, Cecily, for coming and for being an amazing, one lovely person and someone who's taking, it's very ambitious to say this in a museum like this, but someone who's taking painting forward to a really interesting place, and we're all better off for having you. So thank you.
Thank you very much.